Okay, in this trial we evaluated the 8mm penetrometer plunger to determine harvest maturity on nectarines. And the objective was, firstly, the problem was sometimes on a lot of the new nectarine varieties are harvested relatively firm, and the 11mm plunger that we are used to can be problematic, since the firmness readings can be highly variable especially the firmer fruit. And part of the reason of that is that on very firm fruit with 11mm plunger, you can actually get cracks, and that leads to inaccurate firmness readings. So the objective was to determine if the 8mm plunger can be used, and if the readings that we get is accurate enough as an indication of harvest maturity. We did it on 8 cultivars. They were Alpine and Sunburst earlier varieties, then Summer Fire, August Red, September Bright, Regal Pearl, Summer Sweet, and Top Pearl. So there was a number of varieties. We harvested the fruit at 3 intervals during the season, and we tried to start at the maximum flesh firmness on each of these varieties. What we did then at harvest, the firmness was determined on the same fruit on both sides. On the one side with 11mm plunger, and on the other side with 8mm plunger. We also looked at the sugar at that point. And then after storage, we looked at flesh firmness again, and internal and external quality. Just to give you an idea of what we find, this was one of the data sets on Alpine, where we started at 12 kilograms, 11.2 and 8.7. We had significant differences between these maturities. Obviously, with the 8mm plunger, the firmness readings are lower, but exactly the same as with the 11mm plunger, we could find significant differences in the firmness readings between the 3 maturities. The standard deviation was in all cases, obviously because you work with higher figures, was higher with the 11mm plunger compared to the 8mm plunger. I've got this slide in just to show that when we do flesh firmness with the 11mm plunger or the 8mm plunger, the relationship between the two is always the same. So cultivar did not play a role. So if you want to convert from 11 to 8mm plunger, the cultivar will not play a role in that. We established a conversion factor of 1.8 for the 2 plungers, which means that with the current maximum flesh firmness on nectarines, which could be 13.6 in certain cases, 11.3, and the minimum of 4.5. If you had to convert it, it would mean 7.5, 6.3, and I would probably go to 6.5, and then on a minimum, if you convert it, 2.5. So that's how one would, if you had to change, that's the readings that one would look at. So the results, both plungers could accurately distinguish between the different maturities. The standard deviations were consistently higher with the 11mm plunger, and that implies that the variation in the readings that there is a lot bigger variation in the readings taken with 11mm plunger. For me, one of the advantages of the 8mm plunger is that what the picker sees in terms of size or color, if you had to take the firmness readings, there was to me a higher correlation between the firmness reading and the color or the size than with the with the 11 millimeter plunger because of the variation that you find with the 11 millimeter plunger. On firm fruit, as I said, there were cracks, which can lead to inaccurate readings with the 11 millimeter plunger, and this was not a problem with the 8 millimeter plunger. And then a cultivar did not have an effect on the readings between the two plungers. So the recommendations. There are a number of advantages with the 8 millimeter plunger, and the one is less cracking when you take the firmness reading, less variation between readings, and the flesh firmness feedback from importing countries are normally with the 8 millimeter plunger, so one would be able to compare the readings better if you use the 8 millimeter plunger. So the recommendation is to change to the 8 millimeter plunger for flesh firmness determination on nectarines on a trial basis in 2019, and if there are no problems, then one could probably implement it in the following year. And I did not show the results, but what we also established, because the fruit was stored after harvest, on summer fire, it looked like the harvest maturity that is the current harvest maturity should be adjusted because we actually have to harvest the fruit firmer than the current flesh firmness to get good quality.